Welcome to another episode of Profiles in Purpose. On this episode, I'm very happy to be joined by Jared Tailfeathers. He's an author, an artist, and speaker, an educator. He's the author of a book that came out last year called The Art of Making, Rediscovering the Blackfoot Legacy, which is actually just the first in a series of books that he's working on. And his sense of purpose obviously is very much connected to his identity. So I'm very much interested in learning about his personal history and his evolving sense of his own identity and how he helps other Blackfoot folks learn more about their history and help non-Aboriginal folks learn more about the Blackfoot heritage and other First Nations history. So thank you, Jared, for joining me.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Can you tell me a bit? So I know that your father was a Blackfoot, and your mother was not, but you have Ukrainian heritage as well, correct?
No, that's my wife's heritage.
That's your wife's heritage. Yeah. Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, well, my mom's actually from the Mormon settlement town of Cardston, so her family came in at the same time, so she's a Mormon heritage. And my dad's from the Blood Tribe, which is one of the Blackfoot Confederacy nations, and my family still lives down on the Blood Reserve. A couple of people you may have heard of are direct family members of mine. Jared Tailfeathers was an artist who died kind of young. I think he was only about early 50s sometime, but he was a big influence on my art trajectory. It sort of proved that you could be an artist, and not for fame or anything, but that he had lived his life and was able to pay his bills as an artist. So he was a pretty key instrumental in proving that I could do it. And then Dr. Esther Tailfeathers is my aunt, and she's sort of a big deal in Alberta for Indigenous medicine. And then I have a cousin, Ella Maya Tailfeathers, who's an actor. She's been in a few big things in some Hollywood productions and stuff like that. And then my dad was the first Indigenous medical student at the University of Alberta. So when he passed away in '87, when I was 14 months old, a couple of years later, they named an award for Aboriginal students named after my dad. Mm-hmm. And so come from sort of a long legacy of either doctors or artists. And so obviously I lean towards the artist side, but I have steady hands. I could have been a good doctor. But I'm glad that I don't have to cut anybody open or anything like that. It's cutting open art canvases and stuff like that instead. So yeah, I have a good connection with my family down on the Blood Reserve and extended family and all the Blackfoot nations.
And in your book, The Art of Making, you talk about identity, and you talk about how when you were younger, and maybe even now sometimes, people might question your heritage because they might not think you look fully native because you are half. You're mixed. And you're very open about the fact that that's hurtful when people question your heritage. Can you talk a bit about that? Like when you were a kid, when did that come up, and what kind of environment did you grow up in? I understand you grew up in Calgary. You were going to school in Calgary, where often you were maybe the only one or two students who were Aboriginal in your classroom. Is that correct?
Yeah. So when I was growing up, because I didn't grow up in the res, I obviously didn't sound like I was from the res, so I didn't have like a thick native accent or anything like that. And I didn't speak my language. I was mostly raised in like a Christian, European-based education system. So, and when I was a kid, I was lighter. I had lighter hair as well. And so none of the real telltale signs that I was Indigenous, except for some of my features, was there. So I got questioned fairly often. And I wasn't the only one. All the other Native kids I knew that were mixed were questioned all the time about it. And somehow that was important for people to be questioning. I don't know why, but it came up all the time. Like all the time. And maybe it's because my last name. Like, oh, what's the history there? Or people would say you're not quite white. There's something in there that's not quite white looking. And so, that came up. And then when I hit puberty, it changed. I literally got darker, and my dad's features came out more, and then my hair got darker and stuff. So it was a lot easier for people to pick up on that. And nowadays, since I have long hair and as I've aged a little bit, I found out I some of the features a little bit easier to tell as I've aged a little bit. But yeah, it came up all the time. Lots of times it was in negative ways, as sort of a weird in-between place where if I went back home or visited the res, that people would give me the same look but for a different reason.
Yeah.
So, you're not quite native either, so it did come up quite a bit of times.
And I wonder if, as someone who, someone might not know just by looking at you about your native heritage, that they may say derogatory things or make very hurtful jokes about Aboriginal folks, because unfortunately those kinds of jokes are common. I grew up here in Alberta. I remember hearing those kinds of terrible jokes when I was a kid. And I don't know if it was so much that we were motivated by racism when we'd share these jokes. It was more like we like to you say shocking things. So you make derogatory comments about various groups because it feels naughty and bad and thrilling.
Well, and
Yeah,
I definitely. And also that I find that I grew up in the 90s. It's a way to sort of be non-racist, but exceedingly racist. It was really casual.
Yeah.
If you were, your friend group would have different mix of people, and you would make fun of each other. And it was okay for all of you to make fun of each other. When deep down, it's not okay. And especially nowadays, where we're a lot more awake to that sort of talk. That we're like, oh, actually, maybe we internalized some of this stuff, and it wasn't very nice for us to hear that we remember these things that our own friends would say to us, or we would say to our own friends. We're like, that was completely out of line, and something that you want to distance yourself from. So yeah, it certainly did come up.
Yeah.
And I definitely forgive people growing up having those sorts of casual racism stuff. It's a learning curve, and we also, after the internet started, we started to learn more things about each other, and our shared histories would be like, oh wow, the Canadian government wasn't very nice to Indigenous people, completely taken advantage of in lots of regards. Same for Chinese people, same for African and Canadian people, same with Ukrainian people. There's lots of sort of terrible things that as kids you don't really know. You're just a kid, so you just sort of make fun of each other for your cultural differences. And so sometimes you're like, wow, this person said something hurtful to me to be hurtful,
right?
And sometimes this person said sort of off-color thing not to be hurtful, to joke. And so that's, intention is a big part of it. So, yeah, sometimes it was hurtful. I felt hurt by that.
And I wonder how much you felt sometimes like an outsider. Because, for example, I want to tell you a bit about my experience. When I was growing up in a small town here in Alberta, I had my best friend for several years in elementary school. He appeared, I believe he was full Indigenous. He had been adopted by a woman with German heritage who ran a daycare in the town. And so he was her only child. She had adopted him. And I remember my friend, his name was Glenn, and he would sometimes talk about how he wanted to find his real relatives or real family someday, and that he believed that they lived in the Lethbridge area, and that he maybe would want to go live on the reservation someday to be with his real family. And he was the only Native kid in our grade. And I think by disposition he was a naturally very shy person. He had a very strong stutter. So you can imagine for any kid that makes you feel awkward and uncomfortable.
Definitely.
But then on top of that, to be the only Indigenous student in our grade and one of the very few in the school, must have felt very much like an outsider. And I don't know how much I sympathized with him at the time. I did to some extent, but now I think, man, it must have been really tough for him. And did you often feel a bit like an outsider?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it certainly got better when I was in school and I saw other Native kids. Like, hey, I know that kid's a Native kid, or something like that, or my own siblings were around, and so I knew I wasn't the only one around. But yeah, definitely, for lots of times I was the only one there, and in certain curriculum stuff, it would come up. Definitely, if it was the Indigenous curriculum and fur trade and stuff like that. So yeah, sometimes you would feel special that you were the only one, but lots of times it was very alienating. It was super alienating to me because I wasn't very good at school. I was good at art and music and other things like that, but I wasn't very good at math science and stuff, and those are the things that they that care about, right? And so feeling weird in that regard, and then adding on top of that, cultural, racial difference, yes, definitely felt alienated. But then I also felt alienated going to powwows and Sundance and being like, how come I'm not so dark? Well, it's because my mom's a blonde hair.
So you're like an outsider in some ways in both groups. So you can kind of feel not fully in part of either world in a way.
And it's true, but at the same time, because of it is truth, being in the middle gave me a good insight, especially later on in life, about my role as being somebody in the middle.
Yeah.
Is that it was for me not only to experience that stuff for myself, but like as you said, start sharing that with people around me. Not only for my Blackfoot community members, which was really a lot of the reason why I did this stuff, is like, guys, this is where we're from. These are the places that are still around here that we can go see, that you can go, that you live near. You're like a kilometer away from this spot that has cultural significance to us, that shares evidence that this is us, which is special. But at the same time, it's been a good chance for me to connect with people that I grew up with, or people that I know that in and around Calgary and southern Alberta, to expand their story. And being like, if we don't include the whole story, then we're not actually telling the story. We're just telling bits and pieces of it, right? And so it gave me a good opportunity to be able to be a middle ground for that, and be proud of being a middle ground rather than being like, oh, I'm alienated because I don't quite fit into either of these categories, where I can fit into either of those categories, and that's fine. And that makes me more unique, not less unique.
Yes, and I think that's so amazing that you're able to take those feelings of being an outsider and channel them, and you can be a bridge between those two worlds, but you're also a bridge between the present and the past because of the nature of the work you're doing. So can you talk more about your book, what it tried to capture, and the process of making that book? What went into that?
Well, when I was working at the Calgary Public Library, I worked there for 3 years. I was a program coordinator for Indigenous placemaking, which means I mostly curated the Indigenous public art in the library system. I also had access to the library and all the resources there, but also elders from the community. I found out my connection to some of them, familial and also cultural. Started understanding the language a lot better and all these things. And so I went on, because I'm an artist, a visual artist and a musician, I really wanted to bridge those gaps for sure. It was really the goal, was for me to learn more, but also to put in a tactile way is where do we find traditional resources to make certain things, and where are places with stories, where can I drive to that I can see paintings on rocks and stuff like that. And then I found out they were all over the place, and that they were really close, and that if you just hear the traditional stories, it'll give you hints and clues of where those places are, and the names of stuff and the names of places throughout Alberta and Saskatchewan and Montana all connect to each other and things like that. And so I wanted to bridge the gap between traditional methods of making and contemporary methods of making. So that was my goal for the research. And then my research went quickly from just being a tactile sort of resource-based art history to it had to connect to everything, because the stories connected to places connected to resources connected to styles of art, and all these things all connected together. So it was really a crash course of me learning Blackfoot culture and history and locations. So it went from a very small research about making an instrument based on traditional methods of making, but it's a contemporary instrument, to having to have a working knowledge of Blackfoot history and events and locations that have traditional methods of making. And then it grew into a book. Technically, I have well over 10,000 pages of information that I've done over the past 5 or 6 years now that I needed to put somewhere.
Yeah.
And so first I was just going to give all of that information as one big book, I found out very quickly that would be a very expensive book. And so I divided it up into years. So the first year, which is the first book, I had all the information, and then it was a crash course in Blackfoot culture. And then the art part of it was to make instruments based on traditional method of making. And then year 2 was to sort of broaden that, that concept of places on the land and pictographs and other art forms. And then I would make music from those musical instruments that I made the year before, and then other invented musical instruments that I had. And then the year after that, I would make sort of album art to go along with that, or other types of art to go along with that. And all those finished pieces would connect to the next year's finished piece. And then so obviously all the written work would connect to each other. And so instead of trying to do it all at once, really I thought I was going to be done this research last year, but really it's obviously going to take me 5 years into the future before I'm finally done all of that stuff. And I can't I can't shut my brain down or my eyes down. So if I drive past a spot I've never been, I look down the road and I peer at some water or something, or I peer at a hill or outcropping a rock, I'll automatically want to go see it. So unless I literally go everywhere in Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Montana, I won't ever be able to turn it off, even if my projects are done.
Do you feel kind of like a detective when you're doing this? Like you're making discoveries, and there's that thrill of discovery?
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah?
It bridged certain things, not only in like arts and culture, but then I became more knowledgeable about certain things than archaeologists and geologists, because I could connect those dots together instead of all these things being siloed. Archaeologists look for really specific things. They don't ask certain questions that I ask of the place, and so that made it easier for me to find things that they didn't look for. And so I was able to talk to the lead archaeologist in the province and in the city, completely independent of anybody, and then got in contact with Bow Valley College, MRU, University of Calgary, and now the Alberta Museums Association, which is far different than what I wanted. It's more like my goal was just to make work and then research it, and now I actually have a body of work that I can go get my master's and wasn't the goal, but it so happens that I could do that. And I do lots of trainings now because I found out a whole bunch of information and was able to connect a whole bunch of dots and locations, and how that factored into the story of Calgary, how that factors into the story of Canada, how that factors into the story of Treaty 7 and all these other things. And so it really expanded everything in my life.
Yeah, and you're gathering all of these puzzle pieces connected to Aboriginal history and culture. What's the picture that's starting to form with all these puzzle pieces as you gather them?
Well, my wife would say it's probably sending me in the direction of being an educator, which is not really my personal goal, but it's obviously something that if I have the information, I should probably share it, type of thing. So I think her goal for me is that I would be some sort of professor somewhere. My goal is to continue to make work and do things that interest me, and somehow find places for my work to interest other people and help build their own stories and things like that. So I've been able to be involved with projects I never would have ever even considered applying for because of the research and because of the community connections that I've been able to make. And so I'm very fortunate to have just gone with a couple of ideas and ran with them and found out that they connected in so many various ways beyond that. So I don't know. It's the good thing is about being an artist and a researcher and an arts and culture person. If you plateau, that's a bad thing. So it's always ups and downs and doing weird stuff. And so in 10 years, I have no idea where I'm going to be. Maybe I'll get my master's. Maybe I'll get my doctorate. Maybe I'll be a professor. Maybe I'll do none of those things and just make comic books. I don't know.
I first met you a few months ago when you were giving a talk about your book, The Art of Making, at a museum called the Highwood Museum in High River, Alberta. I'm curious, when you give these kinds of talks about your book, what kinds of questions seem to come up a lot, and what things seem to surprise people when you're telling them about Aboriginal history in this area?
The thing that surprises people the most is that the town they live in, it was already a special place before any building was set up there. And the connections between all the highways and stuff, like, oh, I thought that we did that we brought that. And it's partly true, I mean, some of it, but for the most part, all these places were special to us beforehand. And if there are places and mountains that you go to and you're like, there's something special here. We thought that first. Sometimes we thought it for 10,000 years. And so our relationship to these places is deep and ingrained, and we still have names for all of them. And when people start seeing beyond that, they start asking questions about specific places, or they close their mind that, oh, I didn't know that there's a buffalo jump 10 minutes from my house in Nanton, or in High River, or in Fort McLeod, and all these other things like that, or within Calgary. You know, for a lot of people in Calgary, they don't know that there's any Indigenous history. They think that Calgary is established by settlers, and that's the history of Calgary. And that, you know, like places like Scotsman Hill was a buffalo jump, and that's part of the reason why the Elbow River camp, where all the teepees are during Stampede, was put into that location. And you know that the bridge over Inglewood is the original bridge spot that we did. And you know the fort and all the original roads, 9th Ave that turns into the Bow Trail, were the original trails, right? And that information usually blows people's minds, because then they're like, they see it past the founding of Calgary into way further into the past, and say, oh, there's a reason why I like going to this park, because there's spirits here, there's special things here, right? There are things like that. So lots of questions are along that, or specific events. Lots of people ask about how they connect to other things. You know, there's lots of historic events, especially in the 1870s to the early 1880s, in that 10-year period of time, loads and loads and loads of things happen. And people forget that in 1867, when Canada was founded, this wasn't part of Canada. That was out in Ontario and Quebec, and that is Canada. Now, this became that much later, and that the story here is far richer than that sort of story. And people connecting the dots of certain events that paved the way for the founding of Calgary, or for the founding of Fort McLeod and stuff like that, is far more interesting when you add the information from the other point of view than just the settler point of view. And lots of people ask lots of questions about that.
Yeah. Now, obviously, our popular culture here in Canada is dominated by American popular culture, because most popular TV shows and movies are American. So, looking at the big picture, how in general in popular culture do you see how Aboriginal folks are portrayed these days, and how would you hope that the work of yours and other people would change that a bit? Well,
I mean, to go along with the idea of events and the timeline of when things happen, the full story, like I said, it's far more interesting. People find it far more interesting. So hearing that point of view gives a far richer storytelling element than this portrayal that we were somehow the savage interlopers into settlers moving in, where they're the foreign invaders in established territories and countries that we had here.
Right? It's like, who's interfering with who?
Yeah, and so that we're somehow the ones that were the foreign invaders, or watching TV shows where someone's speaking an Indigenous language that says foreign language, and they don't even translate it, and they say foreign language, where that language was probably here for 10,000 years before English was ever here. That English is the foreign language here, right?
Right.
And so that sort of flip is needed. That somehow we were the ones who got rid of the buffalo, where for about 5,000 or 8,000 years, we had no problem with the amount of buffalo were here, and we didn't overhunt them and stuff. And then somehow in the 150 years that fur traders and settlers were here, somehow that's when we chose to get rid of all the buffalo, that we did that, information like that. or that we needed to be civilized or saved from ourselves, where our system didn't need to change until somebody else tried to put a different system in there. And that system is the one that isn't sustainable. We're already running into problems with it, especially in the States. And telling those stories is really important from our point of view. Why? Because we need our point of view out there, but also because it makes the story better. It's really only the last, 8 or 10 years that I've seen real stories for and about Indigenous people. Reservation dogs, even like Yellowstone and a couple other ones. And so it's the lens of Indigenous people and telling stories of residential schools and all these other things that are somewhat horrendous history, but at the same time it's also things we need to talk about. And things that need to be said from different points of view is way more important than this one point of view, which has been since film became a medium in the last 120 years or 150 years or whatever, that it's only been from one point of view for the most part.
Are there times when it feels like not everyone wants to hear that other point of view?
Definitely. You've been your whole life, and the whole life of your parents and your grandparents has been one story, and you hear a story that makes you culpable in horrendous things. Of course you don't want to hear it. You're like, wait a second, I'm proud of being Canadian. I'm proud of being Albertan. I didn't kill thousands of people. But you were still benefiting from the system that did kill thousands of people. What language are we speaking right now? We're speaking Blackfoot? No, we're speaking English. Where our treaty agreements, that's not the case. It was a shared thing. We were never giving up land. And that's the thing that people don't understand. And that they don't want to hear that because it changes the narrative of their own history. Things that they've been proud of their whole lives. My grandpa lived here for 3 generations. We know the mountain passes. We know all these roads, and then find out that it is a blip, a second in the scheme of things of time that it makes you less important. That your history is less important, which isn't true. My mom's settler. Her history is very muddy in some cases when it comes to her shared history with my dad's side of the family and all sorts of other stuff. The railway was built by Chinese people. We don't ever talk about that. And then lots of them died to make the trail. People don't want to hear that part. They don't want to be culpable of that. But the truth isn't here for us to be happy or sad about. It's just for us to know. So it's important for us to be able to see those points of view and challenge your own biases and perceptions. Be like, oh yeah, maybe it is weird that we're speaking English and not one of the nation languages over here. And that maybe the official language of Treaty 7 can be one of these languages and English instead of English and French, where there's not very many French people here, but somehow it's still one of the official languages here, right? It starts to make you question certain things. You're like, oh, okay, this is sort of weird that we do this, but it's the norm. It's been the norm for 100 years, and so people don't like that. They don't want to change.
So maybe one final question for you, Jared, and that is, what drives you to keep doing all the work you're doing despite the apathy or, if not outright hostility from some members of the public, not wanting to hear a different story or a more nuanced, richer story? What drives you to keep going despite that?
Well, the good thing is, for the most part, we're at a time in history here in Canada, maybe not in the United States, where people are a lot more open to that. And there's a lot more mixing of people and cultures. And so people are a lot more open to hearing those stories and to learn more. And like I said, lots of people ask questions about specific spots where they live or where their family set up shop, and they don't know the whole history there. And it makes their own history richer. It makes their own stories richer. Like, oh yeah, my family dealt with this Indigenous family, hired them in our ranch. Now I know why we hired this specific family, because they connected here. I know I could be almost family with these people because we have a shared mixed history together. People don't tend to challenge me on my information anymore because I know a lot of it, and I have been able to back up all my information with primary evidence and stories and stuff. And for the most part, I just want people to know stories and be like, we're as worthy of talking about our history and our methods of knowing as anyone else is. In lots of ways, more so because we've been doing it here for so long.
Yeah.
And because this place never stopped being special to us. And so it'll make other people appreciate it more if they can be like, I feel like I should protect this painting site. It's not my history, but it's our shared history together. And if we erase that, what if somebody erases my history? Right? And so it's a little bit more shared stewardship rather than me and you, us and them type mentality. And so that's why it's just for people to broaden their horizons and maybe blow their mind from time to time. Right?
Well, thank you, Jared, for sharing your story with me and for sharing what drives you to share the stories of other Aboriginal peoples. I appreciate your time.
Yeah, thanks, Jan.